Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Legion beta video. Today we're going to be talking about some of my critiques of Legion. Do keep an eye on the channel over the coming days. This will have a sister video just covering the things that I do really like about Legion. As with everything, there are pros, there are cons. But with Blizzard's commitment to a mop-like patch cycle, 3 raid tiers, meaningful world content, additional dungeons, I think there definitely is a lot to look forward to with the expansion. But let's get right into the video, and we're going to start off with zone choice while leveling. In Legion, you will level through 4 zones before you hit the cap. These zones can be done in any order, however, each zone is relatively short and you will have to finish them all to cap. For players who only play one character, this is fine, but for those of us with more than one, you'll have to repeat quite a bit of content. Back in past expansions like Wrath, TBC, and to a lesser degree MoP, players had choice when leveling their characters. For an example, the Continent of Northrend had 2 starting zones, 2 ending zones, and you could probably get by with skipping 1 or 2 of the middle zones. That meant that you could go through in multiple paths with multiple alts. In Legion, that unfortunately won't be the case. It is kind of unfortunate that the Broken Isles is that small, because the scaling system for endgame content would have resulted in a tremendously large playable area if it had have had more zones. Still, the good news is that the zones that do exist are pretty great. Next, we're going to talk about the RNG heavy loot system. Regulars of the channel will know that I have a mixed opinion on the RNG loot. I think an element of randomness is good. It's always been the case that WoW has had random gear drops, because that's how loot bosses work. I do, however, think that too much randomness can lead into problems, especially when you have layers of RNG active after you have actually rolled and won an item. Legion is continuing the Warlord's push for more RNG, just that now gear has a more variable item level. Essentially, it's designed somewhat to make you consistently run through content more and more to attempt getting the best Warforged roll. First, I think it's a very convoluted system. Second, I think it does devalue the meaning of loot, which is quite damaging to gameplay. One pro that it does create, though, is it does mean that a lot of the content in Legion is more relevant for longer. It could be the case that if they balance it all right, that will be good. And one nice thing about the way that loot works in Legion is that the base item level for gear is always going to be higher the more difficult the content that you do is. So if you're doing, heroic raids, you will be getting really good gear, and it's not a complete RNG silliness system. But still, I do have a worry that that much RNG will create apathy to gearing as a means of wanting to play the game. But there you go, that's my critique on RNG heavy gearing. Next, let's talk about legendary stuff. I have some balanced concerns about legendary items. Legion is going to have a bunch of legendaries. These will be random drops from bosses out in the world, and bosses both in dungeons and raids. They will have a very high item level and have a special effect that is in many cases tailored to your class and spec. I actually do like the spec-based effects to a degree. They can lead to sometimes fun gameplay that influences how you talent build your character, so I think that can be quite cool. The downside of this is game balance. This is not really that important for world content, but these will be active in all forms of content bar queued PvP. I have to worry that the gap between players who do and do not have these legendaries will be too great, and I also worry about the power creep they might introduce into the expansion as players get more and more of them. Obviously, this is a concern that's kind of hard to test at the minute, so it is definitely hypothetical. However, this video is not saying these are all definite problems, it's merely saying that they are concerns. Next, I want to talk about the lack of context with some of the reps. Currently, the rep content is all world quests. The world quest system, I think, is quite good, but the reps kind of stop there. What I would like to see in Legion is Blizzard adding bespoke narrative quests to each of Legion's factions. This would continue their story at endgame, offer unique rewards, and give players a reason to care about their reputations past a singular vendor. In an interview, they said they are not rushing the reps in Legion, so it is always possible that more content will be added in a content patch. And then moving on, Order Hall missions are a concern of mine. I've pretty much said my piece on these, but to cover it quickly, I think that they offer rubbish gameplay that is a really bad way of gating content behind a waiting bar. The idea of sending followers off to unlock a quest for your character kind of feels good, but it breaks down when you realize there are far more engaging ways to lock content off from players, such that they can unlock that content as a reward for doing something with their character rather than just waiting an arbitrary amount of time. If you lock content behind the player accomplishing something, that content feels like a reward. I believe that an approach like that would drive more engagement and retention in the game. That said, the current system is rather innocuous, and it does play a far smaller role in Legion than the Garrison did in Warlords of Draenor. Next up, gear catch-up and content irrelevance. So, a recurring theme with recent expansions is that the gear from a new content patch has made gameplay from the previous patch completely irrelevant. For an example, why care about BRF or High Mole when Tanan gear can pretty much, make all of that irrelevant? I would prefer something, a version of the Burning Crusade model, but one that is a lot more accessible. In my view, content patches should be an addition to the expansion's gameplay and not a replacement for the prior 6 months of gameplay in the expansion. That would make the expansion a platform the developers can develop upon and build upon constantly, rather than doing the equivalent of building a big house with the initial launch of the expansion, only to knock it down 6 months later and replace it with a bloody caravan in the form of a patch which is inevitably going to have less content than the overall expansion did. The current model means that they need to do convoluted gear catch-ups which compress what could be many weeks of gameplay into a few days. All this does is it just ensures that people run out of reasons to play the game faster, and let's be honest, those gear catch-up mechanics are pretty much never as fun as the content that they replace. Next, the lack of a new PvP battleground. One thing that has disappointed me with Legion is that there are no new battlegrounds for the launch. We haven't had a new BG since 2013. I think that's a bit silly. There's no other way to put it. Why rebuild the PvP progression system when they're not going to add fresh content for players to experience within that system? My hope is that patch 7.1 contains new battleground content in addition to the dungeon that we already know about. And next, the lack of a world PvP zone. I think world PvP zones, with a bit of PvE elements, can add a lot to an expansion. Yes, Ashran was rubbish. Yes, Tul'Barat was rubbish. Wintergrasp, I thought, was pretty darn cool. It gave players of all gameplay styles a reason to care about it. It meant that you consistently were doing a thing and had something going on in the world that could engage you when you logged into the game, be it a raid, be it the actual battle itself, or the quests located in the zone. Wintergrasp was not perfectly balanced, far from it, but by being a big silly spectacle of a siege, they got away with that. Tul'Baran and Ashran really seemed to be trying to be closer to a full-on balanced battleground, something which I think was a little bit unfeasible for Blizzard. I do worry that the failure of Ashran will scare them away from this form of gameplay, which is a pity because I think it does have the potential of adding great value to an expansion. Next up, I want to talk about predictable gear. Currently, the vast majority of the gear, as I covered earlier, is based on randomness. And that isn't referring only to the drop rates, it's all Warforged, etc. As much as this might paint me as a scrub, I kinda like the idea of badge gear, as long as it's not too excessive. It's nice to know that when you're unlucky with loot rolls, you're always progressing via some sort of currency system. I think this can combat the apathy that an overbearing RNG system can bring, and overall increase player retention by giving people a constant goal to work towards. I would also like to see raids do something similar to what ICC did with its rings, where players would progress through a reputation as they raided and gain some cool rewards in the process of that. Again, I think all of this would be quite motivating, and so far we haven't seen it happen. Next, I want to bring up spec changes and demon hunters, but with spec changes, a bit of a caveat. So, the spec changes, from what I have gathered from people, are kind of like Marmite. In many cases, there are less buttons to hit and things like that. I think some of the gameplay is still strong, and I think that their overall push for more class fantasy has been something that, as far as how the game feels to play, is quite meaningful. I think it sometimes works quite well. However, there are some specs which are coming off a little bit worse. Now, I think the best way to gauge that for yourself is to hop into the game when the new patch comes out, the pre-patch, and test out the changes, or if you don't have a subscription, try to head onto the PTR. From what I know, you do not need an active sub to test your class on the PTR. So this will be a concern for some people, it will be a pro for other people. There are some specs like the Fury Warrior, which I just adore in Legion, so there are definitely loads of pluses there. Unfortunately though, neither Demon Hunter specs really appeal to me that much as a primarily PvE player. I think the rotation is quite clearly designed to be very accessible to players of all skill brackets, which is fine, but I don't think there is enough headroom there for skill that facilitates like a feeling of mastery over the game's mechanics when you're playing it. Now, I think it has came on a long way. It's just not at the place where I feel like I could main that character or that class yet. I expect it's a class that a lot of people will pick up, and because of its really strong visuals, people will be really impressed, but I have a feeling that it will wear thin over time because there just doesn't appear to be the mechanical depth in there to really make it a sort of class that sticks. However, as with all new classes, big example, the Death Knights, it will undergo lots of change over time, and I've got to imagine that Blizzard will find their footing with that spec. There are some cool ideas with movement and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of potential there, and I think that as time goes on, they should be able to extract a little bit more of that. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. Overall, just some concerns that I've got for Legion. However, overall, I am actually feeling pretty good, mainly because they have been so, they've really been talking about, look, we understand that Warlords didn't have enough content. We know we fecked up the patches. We know we can't do yearly expansions. We know that's not something we should push for. Because they've said all those things, assuming they stick to their word, I actually am feeling pretty positive about Legion. And that is something that I recently covered in a video about Legion kind of saving WoW from this downward kind of trend that it's been on. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching the video. Let me know what your thoughts are, and I will see you next time.